Yeah. So again, Thomas Aquinas' 5 ways are 5 ways to prove God's existence. The only one we're concerned about is the 5th way, which is a really early version of the design argument. And so, in response to the first question, why can't things in nature direct themselves toward a goal? Well, he says they don't have inherent understanding or intelligence within themselves. And not being intelligent, things in nature can't by themselves direct themselves toward a goal. Now, the assumption here is that if they can't do this, and they need an external intelligence to direct them. And here, when we mean a goal, we mean toward the purposes that they serve. He illustrates it with shooting an arrow. I think Paley is much better when he talks about something like a watch that serves various purposes. We'll look at Paley next. So what do they need? Things in nature that have no intelligence themselves in order to direct them toward a particular purpose or end that they serve. Well, what they need is basically an external intelligence to design and build them so that they can fulfill the functions that they fulfill. But folks, please, I don't want to have to talk over you. So who fulfills this need? Well, obviously for Aquinas, the builder and the author of nature is God himself. And so for somebody like Aquinas, there really is only one genuine option, and that would be the God of the Bible and church tradition, the God who has the traditional attributes of God as the maker of the universe. When Hume speculates, logically the premises of the design argument could lead to other types of designers, that the God of the Bible and church tradition is not the only possible conclusion. Well, yes, I think Aquinas, had he read Hume, and remember, Hume writes 500 years after Aquinas, so he didn't read Hume, more like 600 or 700 years after. I think Aquinas could have given Hume the logical point that yes, other conclusions are possible from the premises of the design argument, but do we really want to seriously entertain any of them as an option to God as God is portrayed in the Judeo-Christian tradition? I think Aquinas would say something like that. Now, Paley is writing in the 1800s, actually about 25 years after Hume. Remember, Hume dies in 1776, leaves instructions with his publisher that his criticisms of the design argument are not to be published till after his death. Because frankly, he knows they're going to be controversial. And at that stage of the game, in poor health, he didn't want to, didn't want to deal with answering objections and a firestorm of criticism. Okay, if anybody missed the roll, sign it on the way out. So, somebody asked me about these, but I told them we'd go over it. I gave them some brief answers. What about the watch made it different from the stone? Well, again, the notion of purposes. Remember, another name for the design argument is the teleological argument, T-E-L-E-O-L-O-G-I-C-A-L. Ho telos is a Greek word for end or goal or purpose. And so the argument turns on pointing out that things in nature serve various purposes, as we saw Aquinas do. So what makes the watch different? Well, the watch has a series of intricate parts, all coordinated together to enable it to serve a particular function or purpose. In this case, to enable it to function as a timepiece. And that's what made it different from the stone. The stone had no such complicated inner workings. And so the different answers it implies is, well, Paley says the stone might very well have been there forever. There's no problem concluding that the stone came about as a result of entirely natural forces. Whereas, why does this difference imply a different answer as to its origins than we would say for the watch? Well, the stone might have been there forever, but the watch, we say, well, wait a second. Did the forces of nature conspire together to create a watch that's sitting on the ground? And I tried to bring it home here, right? If you walked across campus and you looked down and you saw some broken twigs that had fallen, or some grass, or some little pebbles, you wouldn't have any problem concluding that they were there solely as a result of the natural forces of the workings of nature. You might want to pass that around again. Some people came in. But if you found a ballpoint pen sitting on the ground, you wouldn't say, well, isn't that interesting? The forces of nature have worked together to produce a ballpoint pen here. No, you would say that somebody had to have designed that object so that the various parts of a ballpoint pen, like this thing here, work together to enable it to serve the function it serves. And the same thing is true for the watch. Why is this an argument from analogy? Well, what is Paley comparing? In an argument from analogy, in its simplest form, you're saying, well, here are two things, and they have certain features in common. And usually these are features that are uncontroversial, that you can inspect them and see that they have features in common. So Paley says, look, things in nature like the eye have things in common with the watch. The eye is also an intricate mechanism with parts that are coordinated well to enable it to serve a particular purpose. So you're pointing out similarities. The watch is like, say, the eye, in that it has a number of intricate parts all working together toward a particular purpose or function. So you say, well, if they have these things in common, might they probably have another less obvious feature in common? So what you say is, well, if the watch needed an external intelligence to design it so that all those intricate gears and springs and all work together as they should to enable it to fulfill its purpose, why then wouldn't an intricate mechanism like the human eye also need a designer? So there's your conclusion. And Paley says what can be said of the eye can be said of a number of different things in nature. And I told you I had an early 1800s version of Paley's Natural Theology that I got at a bookstore. And it's kind of interesting to page through, and somehow I lost it over the years. But it was interesting to look at because there are a number of drawings of various parts of plants and animals where Paley makes the same point over and over again, you know. Now, is this a better, closer analogy, comparing something like a watch to something like the eye, than comparing something like a watch to the universe as a whole? There was this phrase, the clockwork universe. The thought was that the whole universe worked together like a giant machine, that the planets were in such regular, predictable orbits. They knew back then that you could predict an eclipse down to the day and hour by working out mathematically the paths of the planets, you know. So the whole universe was looked at, or at least the solar system, as if it were a giant machine, a giant mechanism with coordinated parts. So, now forget what this says about the problem of evil. We didn't look at the problem of evil, but, you know, I didn't edit that little thing out. So the design argument, remember, Cleanthes is a made-up name. The character Cleanthes is somebody who wants to see God in human terms, give human properties to God, not only intelligence, but other things. Let me go back up. Why is this an argument from and be able to draw out the analogy? Okay, so I draw out the analogy. Okay. What are we supposed to conclude from the design argument? Well, that God, if God exists, and the design argument, as are all arguments from analogy, is not an airtight deductive argument like the ontological argument, where it would be an outright contradiction to accept the premises as true and deny the conclusion. That's what happens in an airtight mathematical or deductive argument, logical argument. The design argument is only probabilistic at best. In other words, if the argument works, the best it can show is that probably things like the eye needed an external intelligence to design them such that they fulfill the purposes that they fulfill. So Cleanthes then compares the universe, as I said, to a giant machine, to a giant clockwork mechanism, which in it has a number of smaller machines, and by this he means the various parts of plants and animals, you know, mechanisms that, you know, by themselves serve purposes. So the basics of the analogy are that if the effects resemble one another, then the causes must be similar. That is, if things in nature resemble man-made objects, And Hume doesn't talk about a watch. Paley talks about the watch. But Hume talks about other man-made objects like ships and houses. So the thought is, if the effects are similar in having parts that are coordinated to fulfill a function or purpose, why couldn't the causes then be similar? Why couldn't they both be caused by an external intelligence, a designer? In the case of man-made objects, it's human beings who have intelligence. But in the case of the works of nature, we're obviously supposed to conclude that the cause of those purposes being in nature and things in nature being constructed intricately so that they fulfill purpose, the causes of that is God himself. Now, Philo doesn't like the analogy, not because it's probabilistic. Philo says, you know what? There are some good probabilistic arguments. There are some good arguments from analogy. He says, we can assume that if a boulder comes loose, we know what it's going to do. Because we've seen rocks roll down the hill many times, we know what's going to happen. We've seen other things where the causes are similar. That, fire burns. I like to illustrate it with a match, right? You take the second match out of the box of matches, and assuming that they're not wet or anything, you know what's going to happen when you strike the second match. The same thing that happened with the first, because analogously, you're comparing nearly exact cases. And so Hume tries to educate his readers that the evidence that an argument from analogy gives for its conclusion, that is, how strong it is, how much it provides evidence for a conclusion that we ought to accept, that depends on the similarity and the degree of similarity of the things you're comparing. So what Philo doesn't like about the design argument isn't that it's probabilistic, but that the things being compared are very dissimilar, especially when we talk about comparing a man-made object like a house or a ship to the universe as a whole. Hume says, is that really a good comparison? So that's the point of Hume teaching about the circulation of blood. He says, look, if you've got exactly similar cases, you've got a very strong argument from analogy, right? If you're trying to compare circulation of blood in one human being to how it does in another, you've got exactly similar cases, right? You're comparing two human beings, and he says it's a very strong argument by analogy to conclude that blood circulates in other human beings the way it does in you. But he says if we depart from the similarity of the compared cases, we may get a weaker argument from analogy, but it might still be a good one. And Hume considers frogs and fishes, which are not like human beings, but even frogs have a circulatory system. I told you, in my day, they actually did live dissections of a frog. I think we did this in biology class my senior year at Baltimore Polytechnic. And there's the frog. And it's cut open and the little heart's beating, right? It's got a circulatory system. So he says it's not as good an argument, but still a good argument to conclude that blood in frogs and fishes circulates like ours. But then Hume says, suppose we're comparing two things that aren't very much alike at all, that have only what we would call superficial similarities. Ever cut a corn stalk open? Or a weed, you look at it, it's got little tubules. Sap runs in those. So there are little tubules, and sap is a liquid, just like blood is a liquid. Tubules in the plant are kind of like veins in us. So does that mean, because there are these superficial similarities, that sap in plants circulates the way blood does in humans? And Hume says if you tried to make that argument from analogy, not only would you have a very weak argument, but you would also have an argument that leads to a wrong or false conclusion, because sap does not circulate. In fact, we're at the time of year when the sap in these trees is going down to the roots. It's not going to come up again till the spring, and takes with it, I believe, the chlorophyll. And as I said, it leaves the xanthophyll and the carotene, which turn the leaves yellow and orange and make things pretty. You got to read between the lines here. What is Hume suggesting? Right? Isn't he suggesting that, look, if we compare very unlike cases, like if we compare a man-made object like a house or a ship to the universe as a whole, because the claim is that God is the designer of the whole universe, he says, might we be led, if they're very dissimilar things, we be led to a wrong conclusion, like the conclusion that sap circulates like blood? You see where he's coming from, right? If Hume's not an outright atheist, he's at least a strong agnostic. The difference being that an atheist says there is no God. An agnostic comes from the Greek word agnoio, meaning I don't know. Somebody who's agnostic says, well, maybe there's a God, maybe there isn't, but I don't know. Agnoia. I don't think Hume believes there is a God. And so, at any rate, so that's what he's trying to say, that the argument from analogy is a weak one. So his quibble then is not that the argument from analogy, that the design argument is an argument from analogy, because he says there are good and bad arguments from analogy. But from Hume's perspective, it's a bad argument from analogy because it compares things that aren't like at all. In other words, for Hume, comparing a house or a ship to the universe as a whole is like comparing sap as it behaves in plants to blood as it behaves in a human body. Two very dissimilar things. So the problem with weak analogies, illustrated by the circulation of blood example, is not just that they don't give us good evidence for the conclusion, but that they could actually lead us to believe in a wrong or false conclusion. Like that God exists, right? Isn't that what Hume is implying, right? As an atheist. I mean, I have no problem with this. I'm a theist, I told you, I don't believe that evolution is an undirected, purely probabilistic random process. And my quibble isn't with organisms that can adapt to their environment and produce more and more complex eyes. Yeah, it's easy to tell the evolutionist story once you start with organisms that are advanced enough to adapt to their environment and say, well, over millions of years we just get more and more complex eyes, so we don't need a designer. Something as complicated as the eye just comes about as a result of natural selection, advantageous variations happening time and time again, more and more complex eyes. Now, I told you, my problem is the problem I had pointed out to me when I was in high school at Poly, when I read a book suggested by my English teacher called Human Destiny by Lecomte de Noy, where a scientist tried to work out the probabilities against even one strand of DNA coming about as a result of pure chance, of pure natural forces. And the probabilities against it are so astronomical that, like David Hume said elsewhere when he wrote on miracles, Hume says, I always choose the lesser miracle. And as a theist, it's less of a miracle for me to believe that an intelligence brought this about than for me to believe that something as complex as a strain of DNA came about purely as a result of natural forces. You can believe what you want, but that's, so, Hume can argue till he's blue in the face here. He still doesn't answer my quibbles about this. Okay, but let's give Hume his continue to give him his day in court. So in the design arguments analogy, I already answered this. To what is the building of a house compared? It's basically the making of a universe. So Philo's view of the analogy then is that it's weak and may lead us to a wrong conclusion. Now, the one thing that you cannot deny is that in nature you do find order, right? You find order in the way our bodies are put together. You find order even in plants, and certainly in other animals. You find order in the way, say, crystals develop, whether it be quartz crystals in the ground or sugar crystals when you heat water. But Philo, remember, Philo is Hume. Philo says, yeah, we can look out there and we can perceive order, but he says, people who use the design argument to try to prove God as the creator and designer of all things overlook the fact that intelligent design is only one possible cause of order. Now, Hume is a non-scientist, right? But as an educated person, educated man, he knows something about the science of his day. And so he brings in forces like magnetism, heat and cold. Remember, it's heating the water with sugar in it and allowing it to cool off that produce crystals that look like a diamond does when it's cut by a jeweler. Look like something that's planned and designed, but they're not. Those crystals form as a result of the laws of nature. Now, of course, a theist would say, yeah, all right, So let's carry this a step further. Who's responsible for the laws of nature? Is that just a happy circumstance? I told you about ice. Most things in solid form are heavier than they are in liquid form, right? If that happened with water, we would be in bad shape, right? When ice formed on top of a pond in the wintertime, if the ice as a solid were heavier than the water, boom, it would fall down on the bottom and take just about everything living in the pond with it. But because of the crystalline structure of ice, the solid form of water is actually lighter than the liquid form, so it floats on top. Now you'd say, isn't that a serendipitous happy accident of nature? You know, but the theist would say, well, is that just a happy accident? Or was there a designer who knew that that's the way water needed to behave when he set up the laws of nature? I'm just throwing this out for you to think about. Now remember, if you write on this, I don't care what side of this question you take. That's not what's going to determine what grade you get on it. What grade you get on it is not going to be determined by whether you take a position that I would agree with. But as I told you before, look at the things in that writing thing that make for a good essay. You know, that's what's going to determine your grade. How well you make the case for whatever position you take. How organized are you? How well did you say things? Are you relatively free of grammatical flaws? Are you saying things just in vague generalities, or are you being specific and actually bringing in some good detail in your discussion? You know, and do you understand, or does your essay exhibit significant misunderstandings of what you're writing on? You know, those are the kinds of things that'll determine whether you get an A, B, C, or worse. And again, you want to do your own work, folks. All right. So does order always imply design? Hume says no. There can be other causes of order. And he speculates of other forces in nature that, and of course, Darwin even takes this a step further and says, well, you know, natural selection, adaptation of species to their environment, advantageous variations that give some members of a species an advantage in the ongoing evolutionary struggle for survival, enable those members of the species to be selected by the process of evolution for continuance, and the other members of the species who aren't as well adapted to be selected for extinction. Okay. So, as alternative options, he throws out several different things. Okay, so that's another line of argument he takes. He says, even if we perceive order, it doesn't necessarily mean that that order comes about as a result of direct design by an external intelligence. The order could come about from something internal in nature, in the way things are constructed. Now, somebody like Paley or Aquinas, I already mentioned, for them there's only one real option going on here. That's that the author of nature is also the God of the Bible and church tradition. But Hume says if you want to be like Cleanthes and not rely much on revelation or on miracles as a way of establishing the veracity of a revelation, as somebody like Damia would do, if you want to be very intellectual like Cleanthes and have your faith be a totally rational faith, Hume says, okay, let's talk about that. More conclusions are possible from the premises of the design argument than the one that Aquinas and later Paley would want to draw, that the author of nature is God as God is conceived in the Judeo-Christian tradition. He says there are any number of possible conclusions, right? For one, he says it's a bad argument to go from observations of a contingent, finite universe that is very imperfect to the conclusion, as theologians like Aquinas would want to do, that the creator of that imperfect, finite universe is both perfect and infinite himself. He says, what if we can just as easily get to the conclusion that the maker or makers of the universe are not perfect, are limited, they're not infinite. He says we could get possibilities. And again, you got to see what Hume is doing here. Hume is not trying to say, you know what, I think it's more believable to think that the designer and maker of this universe was some senile old god who can't even make a universe right anymore and made this because he was half suffering from Alzheimer's, and that's why this world's so messed up. Or the maker of this universe could be some infant god who's just learning how to make universes, and just like the person taking their first pottery class trying to make a vase for the first time on the pottery wheel, this god has messed up this universe and has just moved on. Like, you mess up a vase, you just move on. Right? Well, so Hume says that there are any number of possible conclusions from the same premises that people like Paley and Aquinas use for the design argument. So he says it's not a good airtight argument to conclude that the designer is the one perfect God of the Bible and church tradition, or even that the designer is one. He says man-made objects like houses and ships are designed by committee, and they're built by a number of people with lesser skills. So he says, why couldn't it also be a conclusion from the design argument that the builders of the universe are many? And if that were the case, they wouldn't all have to have all of the attributes we give to God in monotheism. So he doesn't believe we can ascribe human qualities to the deity. And so Philo doesn't think that you can rest the whole of your rational theology on the design argument, because many conclusions are possible. Okay, so we just did Descartes, and we only have a few minutes, so this is going to be a good place, a good natural place to stop. Hopefully get your printout to you. But again, this is there in Blackboard. And remember, there are PowerPoints covering these things, and there are also integrity recordings if you missed a class or two. All those integrity files are dated, and all you have to do is look at them and you can see what they're on, so. All right, folks, thanks for coming. If anyone missed the roll, if somebody could bring it up and put it up here, and just sign it if you happen to miss the roll. And we'll see you Friday. I'll finish Descartes' Meditations